It all started innocently enough. I had been friends with Eric for years, spending countless afternoons and weekends at his house, gaming or just hanging out. His mom, Mrs. Turner, Elena, as she insisted I call her once I turned 18, had always been around, a quiet, friendly presence in the background. She was kind, always offering snacks or asking how school was going. But lately, something had shifted. It wasn't just the way she looked at me, but the way her presence lingered, the way our conversations had become more personal, more intense. I should have noticed it sooner, the subtle ways things had changed. It was in the lingering touches, a hand brushing my arm as she passed, her fingers lingering a little too long when she handed me a glass of water. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was just imagining things. After all, Elena was Eric's mom. Nothing could happen. Nothing should happen. But that day, something in the air was different. It was a Saturday, and I had come over to hang out with Eric, but he had run out to grab something from the store. I stayed behind, sitting in their living room, scrolling through my phone, when Elena came in, her soft footsteps barely audible on the hardwood floor. "Eric's out for a bit," she asked, her voice calm, casual. I nodded, glancing up at her as she walked toward me. She wore a light summer dress, the fabric flowing as she moved, and for a moment, I found it hard to look away. She had always been beautiful, something I had noticed over the years but never let myself dwell on. She was off-limits, untouchable in the most obvious ways. But today, something in the way she looked at me made my pulse quicken. She smiled, her lips curling into something more than just friendly. "You don't mind waiting for him, do you?" "Not at all," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just hang out until he gets back." She stood there for a moment, as if considering something, her eyes scanning the room before settling back on me. "Actually," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper, "I was hoping we could talk." My heart skipped a beat, and I forced myself to meet her gaze, though my mind raced with questions. "Talk about what?" Elena's smile deepened, and she moved closer, her movements slow, deliberate. I've noticed how much you've grown up." Her voice was lower now, the playful lilt of her words making my stomach twist with something I couldn't quite name. "You're not the little boy who used to come over here all the time. You've changed." I blinked, unsure how to respond. My throat felt dry, my heart pounding in my chest as the weight of her words sank in. This was different from any conversation we'd had before. There was an intensity to her gaze, a heat in the way she looked at me that made my pulse race. "Mrs. Turn," I started, but she interrupted me with a soft laugh. "Elena," she corrected, her voice teasing. "You can call me Elena, remember?" I swallowed hard, nodding. "Elena." She smiled again, and this time, the look in her eyes was unmistakable. There was something forbidden in that gaze, something I had never allowed myself to consider. She sat down beside me on the couch, her leg brushing against mine as she did. The contact was brief, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through me. "I've been meaning to tell you," she said, her voice low, intimate. "You've really grown into yourself. You're different now. More mature. Stronger." Her hand rested lightly on my arm, and I froze, my mind spinning. The air between us felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. I should have stood up, should have pulled away, but instead, I found myself rooted in place, unable to move, unable to speak. There was something about the way she looked at me, the way her fingers grazed my skin, that made it impossible to think clearly. "Elena, I started, but again, she cut me off. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, her fingers trailing down my arm, sending a shiver through me. "I know this is complicated, but it doesn't have to be." Her words were like a slow burn, igniting something inside me that I had been trying to suppress for weeks, maybe even months. I had noticed her, the way she moved, the way she looked at me when she thought no one was watching. And now, here we were, alone in the living room, with Eric nowhere in sight. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should stop it before it went any further, but the way she looked at me, the way her body leaned just a little closer, made it impossible to pull away. "Elena," I said, my voice barely a whisper now, "what are we doing?" She smiled softly, her fingers still tracing patterns on my arm. "We're just talking," she said, though her eyes told me there was so much more she wanted to say. "Unless you want more." My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of her words settling over me like a storm. I should have said no, should have stood up and walked away. But instead, I found myself leaning in, the space between us growing smaller with every passing second. This was wrong. I knew it. But the pull was too strong, the tension too thick to ignore. The air between us felt like it was charged with electricity. My mind screamed at me to pull back, to stop this before it spiraled into something we couldn't come back from, but my body refused to listen. Every instinct I had was overridden by the way Elena's fingers lingered on my arm, the softness of her touch sending a wave of heat coursing through me. She didn't move away, didn't break the contact. Instead, she leaned in just a little more, her breath warm against my neck. The subtle scent of her perfume filled the space between us, and I could feel the tension tightening around us, pulling me in despite every rational thought screaming for me to stop. "You're so tense," she whispered, her voice soft, almost soothing, but there was an edge to it, a teasing lilt that made my pulse quicken. Her fingers slid up my arm, grazing my shoulder, sending shivers down my spine. "You don't need to be nervous." "I'm not nervous," I said, though my voice betrayed me, shaky and unsure. I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like leaves in the wind. Elena's lips curled into a soft smile, and her eyes flickered with something unreadable, something that made my heart race even faster. "Good," she whispered, her fingers trailing down to my chest now, the touch light but deliberate. "I don't want you to feel nervous around me." Her hand stayed there, resting over my heart, and for a moment, the room felt too small, too quiet. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears, drowning out everything else. The heat between us was unbearable, the space so small now that I could feel the warmth of her body against mine, even though we weren't quite touching. I glanced toward the door, half expecting Eric to walk in at any moment, but the house was quiet. Too quiet. He wouldn't be back for a while, and I knew that. I also knew I was standing at the edge of a line I couldn't cross. "I don't know if this is a good idea," I whispered, my voice low, barely audible. Elena's hand moved to my jaw, gently turning my face back toward hers. Her eyes met mine, and there was no hesitation there, no uncertainty. "It doesn't have to be complicated," she said softly, her fingers brushing my cheek. "We're both adults." The way she said it made it sound so simple, so easy. But it wasn't. This was Eric's mom, the woman who had known me since I was a kid. I couldn't just cross that line. Could I? She leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my ear, and I felt a shiver race down my spine. "Unless you don't want this," she whispered, her breath hot against my skin. "Tell me to stop, and I will." Her voice was soft, almost tender, but there was an undeniable intensity beneath it. The choice was mine, but the temptation was overwhelming. I could feel my resolve slipping away, the pull between us too strong to resist. I should have told her to stop. I should have stood up and walked away, but instead, I found myself leaning in, my body betraying me as I closed the distance between us. My mind was a mess, thoughts jumbled, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not Eric, not anything beyond the way her touch made my skin burn with anticipation. "Elena," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but it wasn't a plea for her to stop. It was something else entirely, an acknowledgement of the pull between us, of the line we were about to cross. She smiled softly, her lips grazing my cheek as she moved closer, her body pressing against mine now. "It's okay," she whispered again, her voice soothing, coaxing. "Just let go." And with that, the last of my resolve crumbled. I turned toward her, my hand sliding into her hair as I pulled her closer, my lips finding hers in a kiss that was slow, hesitant at first. But the moment our lips touched, everything else disappeared. The guilt, the hesitation, the doubt, it all melted away in the heat of the moment, replaced by a wave of desire that consumed me. Elena kissed me back, her lips soft but insistent, and I could feel the tension between us unraveling, the slow build of something we had both been trying to deny. Her hands moved to my chest, her fingers curling into my shirt as she pulled me closer, deepening the kiss. It was everything I had tried not to think about. Everything I had been avoiding for months, maybe even longer. But now that it was happening, there was no going back. We had crossed the line. I pulled back slightly, my breath shaky, my heart pounding in my chest. "This is wrong," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. Even as I said the words, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The connection between us was too strong, too intoxicating. Elena looked at me, her eyes dark with desire. But there was something else there too, something softer, more vulnerable. "It doesn't have to be," she said softly, her hand sliding up to cup my cheek. "No one has to know." Her words hung in the air between us, and I felt the weight of them settle over me like a heavy blanket. She was right. No one had to know. But that didn't change the fact that we had crossed a line we couldn't undo. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts, but then she kissed me again, and all my doubts melted away. There was no turning back now. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. My hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as I deepened the kiss, my body pressing against hers. I could feel the heat radiating off her, the tension between us building with every passing second. The room felt too small, the air too thick, but I didn't care. All I cared about was the way her body moved against mine, the way her touch made my skin burn with a desire I couldn't ignore. We pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily, the space between us charged with an intensity one had never felt before. Elena looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of desire and something else, something deeper, more complicated. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice shaky. She smiled softly, her hand sliding down to rest on my chest. "Maybe," she said, her voice low, intimate. "But it feels right." I didn't know how to respond. Everything about this was wrong, but at the same time, it felt so right. The connection between us, the pull that had been building for months, it was too strong to deny any longer. I leaned in again, kissing her softly, and this time, there was no hesitation. No guilt, just the overwhelming need to be closer to her, to feel her body against mine. Her hand slid up to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of her breath against my skin, the softness of her lips against mine. Every touch, every kiss, sent a wave of heat coursing through me, and I knew then that there was no going back. We had crossed the line. We lingered in the heat of the moment, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. The room felt impossibly small now, the world outside non-existent. It was just Elena and me, tangled in something we had both tried to ignore for far too long. Her hand slid down my chest, slow and deliberate, and I could feel the tension in every small movement she made. The softness of her touch was in stark contrast to the burning intensity of what was happening between us. My heart pounded in my chest, and despite the overwhelming desire, there was a flicker of doubt gnawing at the back of my mind, an awareness of just how far we were about to go, of the line we had already crossed and the deeper line that lay ahead. "I shouldn't," I murmured, my voice shaky, my breath catching in my throat as her fingers moved over me, light but firm. Elena's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I could see the same conflict mirrored in her gaze, desire laced with guilt, attraction mixed with the weight of what this meant. But instead of pulling back, she leaned in closer, her breath warm against my skin. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," she whispered, her voice soft, almost tender. But there was an urgency in the way her hands gripped me, in the way her body pressed closer, as if she was silently urging me to forget the consequences. My thoughts were a blur, a mess of emotions that made it impossible to think clearly. I knew what this meant, knew that if I let this continue, there would be no going back. And yet, the pull was too strong, too intoxicating. Every rational thought was drowned out by the way her touch made my skin burn, by the way her eyes lingered on mine as if daring me to give in. "Elena," I whispered, her name barely escaping my lips. She smiled, a soft, almost sad smile, as if she understood exactly what was running through my mind. "You've thought about this, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her that I hadn't thought about it, that this was all too sudden. But the truth sat heavy on my tongue, refusing to be denied. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Elena's fingers brushed my cheek, her touch sending shivers through me. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to say it." But I didn't need to. The truth was written all over my face, in the way my body responded to hers, in the way my breath caught every time her hand lingered on my skin. I had thought about this about her for longer than I cared to admit. And now, in the quiet heat of the moment, I couldn't pretend otherwise. Her lips brushed against mine again, soft and slow, and I kissed her back with the same tentative urgency. Every touch, every kiss, felt like a step closer to something neither of us could undo, a line we were about to cross that would change everything. And yet, neither of us stopped. My hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and I could feel the warmth of her body pressing against mine. The tension between us was unbearable now, the weight of what was happening crashing down on me like a tidal wave. But I couldn't stop. The connection between us, the desire that had been building for months, it was too powerful, too overwhelming to resist. Elena's hand slipped beneath my shirt, her fingers tracing slow patterns across my skin, and I gasped at the sensation, my mind spinning with the intensity of it all. Her touch was both familiar and foreign, a reminder that this was real, that we were really doing this. And as her lips found mine again, more insistent this time, I knew there was no going back. We moved together slowly, cautiously, as if testing the boundaries of what we could allow ourselves. Every touch felt like a small transgression, every kiss a deeper dive into the unknown. And with each moment, the tension between us grew, building to a crescendo that neither of us could stop. "Elena," I whispered again, my voice trembling with a mixture of desire and doubt. "This is—" She pulled back slightly, her breath coming in short gasps, her eyes wide with the same uncertainty that I felt. "We can stop," she said softly, though her voice was filled with a quiet desperation. "Just say the word and we'll stop." But I didn't say the word. I couldn't. The pull between us was too strong, the heat of her body against mine too overwhelming. I wanted her. I wanted this. Instead of speaking, I kissed her again, harder this time, and she responded in kind, her hands sliding at my back as she pressed closer to me. The room felt stifling, the air thick with the tension between us, but I didn't care. All I cared about was the way she made me feel, the way her touch sent waves of heat through me, the way her lips moved against mine with a kind of urgency that made it impossible to think about anything else. We pulled apart again, both of us breathing heavily, the space between us charged with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Elena's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I could see the same conflict in her gaze, the guilt, the desire, the overwhelming need to be closer. "This can't happen again," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. I nodded, though the words felt hollow. We both knew that wasn't true. Once we crossed this line, there would be no undoing it, no pretending it didn't happen. And despite everything, I knew that neither of us wanted to stop. Her hand slid down to mine, her fingers intertwining with mine as she pulled me closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "Just tonight," she said softly, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. "No one has to know." I swallowed hard, my heart racing as the weight of her words settled over me. No one had to know, but we would know, and that was enough to change everything. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts, but then she kissed me again, and all my doubts melted away. The connection between us, the pull that had been building for so long, it was too strong to deny any longer. We moved together, slowly at first, testing the boundaries of what we could allow ourselves. Every touch, every kiss, felt like a small rebellion, a step further into the forbidden territory we had both been trying to avoid. But with each moment, the tension grew, the intensity of the connection between us building to a point where neither of us could hold back. I pulled her closer, my hands gripping her waist as I deepened the kiss, and she responded with the same urgency, her body pressing against mine in a way that made my heart race. The guilt was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming desire that consumed me. We pulled apart again, both of us gasping for breath, and the room seemed to spin around us. I could feel the weight of what we were doing pressing down on me, the knowledge that this would change everything between us. But I couldn't stop. Neither of us could. "Elena," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was going to say. There were no words for what I was feeling, no way to express the confusion, the desire, the guilt that swirled inside me. She looked at me, her eyes filled with the same emotions, and for a moment, we just stood there, the tension between us unbearable. We had crossed the line. There was no going back now. And yet, neither of us knew what would come next. The weight of what we had done hung in the air, thick and suffocating. We stood there, breathing hard, our bodies still close, but the intensity of the moment shifting into something darker, something heavier. The reality of what had just happened, what we had crossed, crashed down on me all at once. Elena stepped back slightly, her fingers lingering on my chest as if she didn't want to let go, but the look in her eyes was different now. The hunger, the desire, it was still there, but beneath it was something else. Something deeper. Guilt. "We shouldn't have," she whispered, her voice shaky as she ran a hand through her hair, her breath still coming in shallow gasps. "This wasn't supposed to happen." I swallowed hard, my heart still racing in my chest. The adrenaline was still pumping through me, but it was now tinged with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. She was right. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it had. I looked at her, my mind spinning with everything that had just transpired, with the consequences of crossing that line. The moment of passion, the raw connection we had shared, it couldn't be undone. And now, the weight of it settled on both of us. "Elena," I whispered, unsure of what to say, of how to make sense of the mess we had just created. But she cut me off, her voice soft but firm. "Don't," she said, shaking her head as she took another step back, putting more distance between us. "Don't apologize." It was mutual. I could see the conflict written all over her face, the same internal struggle that had been eating away at me ever since that first kiss. We had both wanted this, both felt the pull between us for far longer than we had admitted. But now, the reality of it was setting in. And it was heavier than either of us had anticipated. She turned away, her hand coming up to cover her mouth as if she were trying to hold back everything she was feeling. I wanted to reach out, to pull her close and tell her that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Because I didn't know if it would be. "This can't happen again," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. It just can't." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The connection between us, the way our bodies had responded to each other, it wasn't something we could easily ignore. And yet, we both knew the truth. We couldn't do this again. It wasn't just about us. There were too many other people involved, too many lives that could be affected if anyone found out. "We can forget this ever happened," she said, her voice barely audible. "It'll be like it never happened." But as the words left her lips, I could see the doubt in her eyes. We both knew that wasn't possible. This moment, this connection, it had changed things between us. It had left a mark that couldn't be erased, no matter how much we wanted to pretend otherwise. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, but the weight of the situation was too much to bear. "What about Eric?" I asked, my voice shaking as I said his name. Elena flinched, her eyes squeezing shut for a moment, as if hearing her son's name made the guilt even more unbearable. "He can never know," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "This can never get back to him." I nodded, my stomach twisting into knots. Of course, he couldn't know. How could I ever look him in the eye again if he did? But keeping this secret, burying it deep inside, it felt impossible. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, as we stood there, both of us grappling with the enormity of what had just happened. The desire that had fueled our actions had faded now, replaced by a cold, stark reality that left us both shaken. "I should go," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The room felt too small, the walls closing in on me. I needed to get out, needed to escape the suffocating weight of what we had done. Elena nodded, but she didn't look at me. "Yeah," she whispered. "You should." I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to leave things between us. But there was nothing left to say. We had crossed the line. We had shared something that couldn't be undone, and now we were both left with the consequences. I turned and walked toward the door, my mind still spinning, my heart heavy with guilt and confusion. As I reached for the handle, I heard Elena's voice, soft and shaky behind me. "Liam?" I froze, my hand hovering over the door, and turned back to look at her. She was standing there, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression torn between sadness and something else. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen." I swallowed hard, my throat tight as I nodded. "I know," I whispered. "Me neither." We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. And then, without another word, I turned and left, the door closing softly behind me. As I walked down the street, the cool evening air washing over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. My relationship with Elena would never be the same again. But more than that, I knew that this moment, this night, would haunt me for a long time to come. The guilt was heavy, suffocating, and yet, beneath it all, there was still that flicker of something else. A longing, a desire that refused to be buried. I knew it wasn't over. Not really. No matter how much we told ourselves that we could forget it, that it was a one-time thing, the connection between us was too strong to ignore. As I walked away from her house, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What would happen the next time I saw her? Could we really pretend like nothing had happened? Or would the tension between us only grow stronger, pulling us back into the same dangerous territory? I didn't know. All I knew was that things between us had changed, and there was no going back. The future was uncertain, and the weight of what we had done hung over me like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. But despite everything, the guilt, the confusion, the fear, I couldn't deny the truth. A part of me wanted it to happen again.